get to know Chris better and to serve alongside of him, and I'm really excited about his addition to our team. My wife Deborah and I have been married for over 31 years. Can you imagine the size of the mansion she has waiting for her in heaven? When we first got married in Calgary, we moved into a basement apartment suite. And when we moved in, we had enough furniture to fill the back of a pickup truck. Remember those days, those of you who got married and just started out with very little? Yeah. 1 year later, we moved back to Caronport, Saskatchewan. I was going to carry on my Bible college training. And in 1 year, we managed to accumulate enough stuff to fill a 20-foot pup trailer that pulled behind a semi going out to Caronport. I have no idea how we went from a pickup truck to a 20-foot trailer in 1 year, but we managed to do it. We're just gifted that way. 3 years after arriving at Caronport, we bought our first home in Moose Jaw. I was on staff at the Alliance Church there. And lo and behold, if we didn't all of a sudden have enough furniture to fill a 3-bedroom house. What happened? Where is this coming from? Well, that trend has continued on our whole life together. And our home right now isn't extravagant by any means, but we have a ton of stuff. And we find ourselves asking the question as we get a little bit older, what in the world are we going to do when it comes time to downsize? Where is all this stuff going to go? We've both moved grandparents from their last home into their long-term care at the end. We've both moved parents into long-term care. And we know how much stuff that we had to give away or even tragically throw away because there was so much stuff. Well, one of the terms for this is acquisition creep. And there's actually 2 meanings to this phrase. The first is what I just described, which I think many of us can relate to, the ever-increasing amount of stuff we tend to acquire and accumulate over time. The second meaning of acquisition creep has to do with the constant draw to replace what we already have with something newer and better, regardless of whether we need to replace it yet or not. For example, I drive a 2005 Honda Civic. Oh yeah, it's an OB special. It's a perfectly reliable car. It's good on gas mileage and inexpensive to keep maintained, but it looks like a 2005 Honda Civic, and it feels like it when you drive it, a 2005 Honda Civic. But I regularly find myself, even though it is totally reliable and just fine, dreaming about a 2023 Honda Civic. What would that be like? I don't need it, but what would that be like? Or how about the tools that I use for my woodworking and renovation projects? A number of years ago, I bought a table saw at the townwide garage sale that we have in Gibbons every year. And by the way, if you've never been part of a townwide garage sale, oh my goodness, you have to experience that at some point in your life. It is either to you heaven or the exact opposite, but it is something, I'll tell you that. But I bought this table saw, $50. It is a beast of a table saw, and it's nothing special, but it gets the job done when I need the job done. So why is it that every week when I get that Home Depot email, I'm scanning through, looking to see if that DeWalt 10-inch table saw is on sale? I know far too many people who own a smartphone for about a year, and that's the max, because then they've got to upgrade to the latest, newest model. Or others who have had to get rid of their perfectly good 55-inch TV because they got a great deal on a 75-inch one. Or those who only let their vehicles get a year or two old and then they're off to the dealership to upgrade to a newer model. Where does it all end? In fact, recently, someone told me that they saw a 2023 Dodge half-ton truck advertised, all the bells and whistles you can imagine, for the get this price of $170,000. And people keep buying them. Acquisition creep. Accumulating more and more over time, or constantly replacing perfectly good stuff with newer and more expensive stuff, whether we really need it or not. If you were honest with yourself, can you find any example of acquisition creep in your life right now? I'll bet the person that you're with here today could point it out if it exists in your life or not. Or maybe for those of you who are watching online, just put an honest yes in the chat area if this applies to you. I think it does to all of us to some degree. I mean, I'm one to talk. Deb and I are empty nesters now. 2 of us in the house. That's 2 drivers. 3 vehicles in our parking lot, driveway. Doesn't take us long if we take a look to find that acquisition creep in our life, does it? I believe it's one of the reasons why there's been a movement in recent years to simplify, to downsize, to declutter our lives. Many people have begun to realize that, especially in North America, we have such a misguided view of what is an appropriate level of lifestyle. And the pendulum has begun to swing in the other direction in hopes of trying to correct this. I wonder if we all took full inventory of everything we have in our kitchen at home, how many things we would find that we never use, or we've used maybe once since we bought it 5 years ago. But what do we tell ourselves? What self-talk goes on? I might need that sometime, so I should get it. Or down in my workshop, I'll use that tool someday, I just know it. Or maybe in your garage or Quonset, men. I know I already have 2 quads, dear, but this one was such a good deal, I just couldn't pass it up. Yeah, a little nervous laughter, eh? Hits kind of close to home for us. Is it so wrong to have stuff? No. I don't believe owning things is in and of itself inherently bad. But the way we view it, the way we possess it, is often very wrong. This weekend is the second in our series titled Money Matters. Last week, Pastor Rob reminded us that what matters most is not actually our money, but the condition of our heart. And when the attitude of our heart slips into more, we find ourselves in a place that is very unhealthy, very addictive, and often very destructive. Acquisition creep is certainly a sign that we likely struggle with the thought of more, far more than we realize we do. But you know, this type of thinking is not that hard to correct. It does require some discipline, a determination to stop accumulating, and perhaps a choice to reduce our standards just a little from where they've been. But learning to be content with what we have is possible to do. I know this because God is walking me on that journey and has been for a few years now. I'm changing the way I think about more or newer. And the bonus is it's helping me better manage the resources that God has entrusted to my care. The harder attitude to change, the one that I want us to take a look at today, is the danger of a heart that is focused on mine. Pastor Wade wanted me to show the clip from Finding Nemo here with all the seagulls. And we laugh at it, but it is a reality in our world. And I want us to look at a small section in the Gospel of Mark this morning from chapter 12, where we find Jesus being asked a question by the religious leaders of his day. And just before we get into it, a word on the context here. This little section in Mark 12 falls within what we call Holy Week. Just a couple of days after Jesus has entered Jerusalem with all the parade and celebration and the people singing and praising him. But the chief priests and the teachers of the law and the elders looking for a way to arrest him and get him out of that spotlight. So with that context, let's look at Mark 12, verse 13. Later they sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to Jesus to catch him in his words. So the Pharisees, we know these guys, we've seen them before. They're part of the religious leadership of the Jewish people. And they're all about keeping religious laws. But they were often chastised by Jesus for being hypocrites. Because while they appeared to live perfectly on the outside, inside they were filled with every kind of sin that you and I battle with. Hate, condemnation, envy, greed, pride, you name it, they owned it. So that's the Pharisees. But who were these Herodians? Well, I'm going to answer that by quoting from the website gotquestions.org, which is a great resource for answering questions you may have as you read and study the Bible on your own. Here's what that website says. The Herodians held political power, and most scholars believe that they were a political party that supported King Herod Antipas, the Roman Empire's ruler over much of the land of the Jews from 4 BC to AD 39. The Herodians favored submitting to the Herods and therefore to Rome for political expediency. And this support of Herod compromised Jewish independence in the minds of the Pharisees, making it difficult for the Herodians and the Pharisees to unite and agree on anything. But one thing did unite them: opposing Jesus. So we have Pharisees and Herodians, two opposite power groups, united behind one common threat they both feared, the threat being Jesus. Their goal? To catch him in his words. They wanted to trick him to say something that would warrant arrest and death by either side, and they really didn't care which side won, just as long as the end result was the same. Let's pick it up at verse 14. They came to him, these two groups, and said, "Teacher, we know that you are a man of integrity. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are, but you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? Should we pay or shouldn't we?" Now, if you want a lesson in greasing someone with your words, this is it. They wax eloquent about Jesus and his integrity, about his steadfastness in his conviction, even about his extensive biblical knowledge. They butter him up real nice. And then they drop their bomb as they pose a question they think is impossible to answer without digging himself into a hole. I find it incredibly ironic that the question they agreed to bring to Jesus is a question that would have caused enormous debate and disagreement between these two groups in any other scenario. The Herodians would adamantly approve of paying taxes to Rome, while the Pharisees viewed these taxes as Rome robbing the Jewish people. So it's no surprise to me that they came with this question to Jesus, as they were certain he would have to choose one side over the other and thereby condemn himself and be silenced by whichever side he didn't support. One more brief observation about what they said. Do you think for a moment that they truly believed all the wonderful words they said about Jesus before their question? They were so nice and complimentary to him, and then they drop that question to try and trip him up. I don't believe they meant it at all, and I don't think Jesus did either. And we see that in the next passage. Should we pay or shouldn't we? But Jesus knew their hypocrisy. "Why are you trying to trap me?" he asked. "Bring me a denarius and let me look at it." I love this. Jesus, who as Son of God is all-knowing, saw right through their flowery words and their unlikely alliance. Or as Mark plainly put it, he knew their hypocrisy. But instead of walking away from them or refusing to speak, he asks for a coin. Now, a denarius was a coin that in that day was equivalent to maybe a loonie or a toonie today. It was the common monetary coin used by Rome, and it represented a day's wage for most ordinary people. It would have been instantly recognized by both sides on this question as a symbol of Roman authority over the Jewish people. And therefore, it would have been a powerful visual reminder of the two opposing views held by the Herodians and the Pharisees. So even just by using a coin, Jesus is showing both groups he's fully aware of their plan and their hypocrisy. It's fantastic. I love it. But then he takes it to a whole new level with what he says next. They brought the coin, and he asked them, "Whose image is this? And whose inscription?" "Caesar's," they replied. And Jesus said to them, "Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." And they were amazed at him. I think Mark undersold that just a little bit. I think they were speechless. What do you say to someone? What can you say to someone when they attempt to trap you with their words, and then you suddenly find yourself, you attempt to trap them with your words, and all of a sudden you find yourself sitting in the very trap you made with no idea of how you just got there? They couldn't say a word back to him at all. Jesus completely disarms their attempt to trip him up. He acknowledges that Rome had the current authority by pointing to that coin. It was a Roman coin, remember? And he affirmed both paying taxes and giving back to the Lord. Roman law and Jewish law all adhered to in one complete sentence. It was masterful. But what does this have to do with this heart attitude of mine, mine, mine that we talked about a little earlier? Look a little closer at the words Jesus used. Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Jesus' answer to this trick question was not only masterful in disarming their scheme, but it was deeply profound in what it taught everyone who heard it, because his answer pointed directly to the issue of ownership. Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's. By pointing to the portrait and the inscription on that coin and making this statement, Jesus was in essence saying that whatever value was assigned to that coin was there because those in authority over the people had minted the coins, had assigned value to them, and provided the backing for the value of those coins. So basically, Rome owned those coins. And if they demanded some of them back in what was called taxes, then they had a right to get them back. Now, had Jesus stopped there, he would have thrilled the Herodians and completely offended the Pharisees and a whole bunch of Jewish religious law. But his next phrase brings the whole thing together. Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Now, to a Pharisee, what did that mean? It meant something that they knew and they taught all the time. It all belongs to God. You see, a Pharisee would know by heart the words of David in Psalm 24:1. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. A Pharisee would know the words of God to Job in Job 41. Everything under heaven belongs to me, God said. And a Pharisee would definitely know the words Moses spoke at the end of his life to all the Israelites in the desert when he said, "To the Lord your God belong the heavens, even the highest heavens, the earth and everything in it." A Pharisee would know and would teach that God owns it all. And he'd realize that Jesus was reminding everyone that money, no matter what it looks like, is not ours to own. We are but managers for God of what he entrusts to us. And we can't miss the order here of what Jesus has said. We are told numerous times in the Bible that God establishes rulers and kings, and that those in authority over us are to be respected and obeyed because God has placed them there. So by saying first that we are to give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, Jesus reminds us that obedience to those in authority over us is obedience to God. And then he affirms that God owns it all anyway. Well, so much for mine, mine, mine. So much for the issue of acquisition creep, whether due to greed or pride or whatever drives it. After I read this, now I need to tune my heart to think his. And I need to begin to ask myself questions like, how much do I actually need to live on? And God, what do you want me to do with the rest? And that, for me, has been a game changer. Now, you might be thinking, but don't we only have to give 10% as a tithe? Because the way you just said that, Pastor Greg, it kind of sounds like if I pay my taxes and I can live on 40% of what's left, I have to give the rest back to God? No, I did not say that. Jesus did. But I don't think he was instructing us to actually give it all back to God through a tithe envelope at church. If you want to do that, that's great. We'll find a way to use it. But God makes it clear in other places in the Bible that we are expected to faithfully tithe. And Pastor Al is going to talk about our attitude towards giving next week as he wraps up this series on Money Matters. I don't think Jesus was telling us here that we have to give it all to God as cash. But I do think he was challenging us to stop viewing our money, our wealth, our material belongings as all ours. And to start understanding and living our role as stewards of God's resources rather than owners of mine. So how do we do that? How do we change this deeply ingrained attitude of self-protection, possessiveness, and even greed to one of humble stewardship for God? Well, I think it starts with making a choice to view this issue of ownership differently than we have. I've told this story before, but it's the best illustration I know of, and God brings it back to mind month after month, sometimes week after week for me in this journey I'm on of learning with him. About 9 or 10 years ago, I was sitting in my office at the previous church where I worked, and a fellow staff member got a call from his wife. She and their 3 little kids had been in Edmonton shopping, and on the way home, they hit an icy patch and skidded into the ditch, and the car rolled onto its roof. They were all okay. She called them and said, "Don't worry, we're fine. We're sitting in a police cruiser, but we need you to come and pick us up because we're not driving home." So Nathan jumped in his car and peeled out of the parking lot to go pick them up. And he told us at church the next Sunday, as he shared this story with us, as he started onto the street, he prayed a simple prayer. He said, "God, your car is on its roof in the ditch. What do you want me to do about it?" This young pastor and his wife, they got it. At a young age, they had discovered and were living by the principle that Jesus taught that day with a denarius coin. They were living in the reality of his in their everyday life. And the freedom and contentment and clarity it has brought to their life is something many, many people will never experience because so many of us live with a self-focused attitude of heart about money. What would it take for you to go from mine, mine, mine to his? And maybe the deeper question or tougher question is, are you even willing to ask Jesus to change your heart in this? What else can we do? Well, it's not popular to say this, I know, but it is April. And as citizens of Jesus' kingdom and citizens of our country, we need to give back to Caesar what is Caesar's. And that means we need to willingly and truthfully pay our taxes. Now, there's many legal and fair deductions that are available to us, and we have every right to maximize those. But as I read what Jesus said, we don't have a right to fudge the numbers, and certainly not to avoid or refuse to pay our taxes. Now, Jesus was telling this to people being taxed by Rome, and Rome were horrible oppressors of the Jewish people. His listeners that day, they would have experienced little to no daily benefit of their tax dollars going out. But that's not the case for us. Regardless of whether you like the current ruling political party in any level of government, in any Canadian context, we do receive a lot of blessing through our tax dollars. Education, healthcare, infrastructure, community safety. There's a big list of ways that we do benefit in everyday life. And we have a responsibility to be good citizens in that way. Another really practical thing we can do, we can take stock of what we already have that we can share with others. A couple of questions. Are there 5 things at home right now that you haven't touched or used in a long time that you could generously pass on to your community around you? Maybe a tougher question. Are there 5 things in your possession right now that you might struggle to think of in terms of his, or that you would have difficulty sharing with someone else? That might reveal a heart issue that you need to address. Lastly, one of the things Pastor Rob encouraged us to consider last week was making and living by a budget. Not only does that help us to better steward the resources God has put under our care, but if you're serious about being a better steward, a budget will make it clear what you actually need to live on. And it will likely reveal to you that God often blesses you with more than you really need. Once we start admitting what is genuine need and what isn't. And then we have the opportunity to begin asking God, what do you want me to do with the rest? Money matters. And how we handle our money will, in large part, be determined by the attitude we have about who owns it. I know that a message on money or 3 messages in a row on money, that can cause some stress for some of us. I get that it is not popular at times. If that's where you're at, can I encourage you to ask God to check your heart? I'm not preaching this, we're not preaching this series to beg for your money. We're preaching this series because this was important to Jesus. And if we want to go God's way, it needs to be important to us. And then I can tell you, from personal experience in this journey that I'm on, that choosing to live as a steward rather than as a possessive owner has brought a stress-free reality to my life when it comes to money that I never thought was possible. Wouldn't it be awesome to live free from the stress that money often brings to us? It is possible. And I am so grateful that God is changing my heart like this. This has only been a recent journey for me in the last few years. But what a journey. And I don't ever want to go back. Are you willing to ask God to change your heart today? Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for the way you bless us. Thank you for the promise that you give that just like clothing the flowers of the field and feeding the birds of the air, that Our Father will never let us down. But Jesus, I also recognize that this area of money and wealth and possessions can take such a hold on our lives. I know the hold it had on me for so long. And I don't know where each person listening today, each person that's here, where they're at with you on this. But I pray, Jesus, that you would help them to move another step further in this journey with you. I pray that as you challenge hearts, that we would be willing to open our heart to you and trust you a little bit more. Put your words to the test and surrender ownership back to the one who owns it all already anyway. And Father, as we walk this journey with you, be gentle, but be persistent. We want to be in step with you in all things in our life, including and maybe even especially how we view money. Thank you for your love for us. We love you right back. In Jesus' name.